Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, a interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And I am Benedict Rogers. And in fact, today is my first day, first few hours in my new role as Chief Executive of Hong Kong Watch. I co-founded the organization 3 years ago and have been chair of the trustees for the last few years and doing this work supposedly in my spare time, and now I'm doing it full time. And it's an enormous privilege and pleasure to welcome as our guest for this episode, Stephen Kinnock MP. Stephen is the shadow minister in the opposition foreign affairs team responsible for Asia, and for those of you who are watching from outside the UK, in the Labour Party, which is the main opposition party in Britain. So Stephen Kinnock, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And congratulations on your new role.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, perhaps I can ask as a first question, perhaps a somewhat personal question. I had the great privilege of working very closely with your mother, Glenys Kinnock, on human rights issues, particularly on Burma. And she was always a great inspiration to me in that work. And I'm wondering, in your role as Shadow Minister for Asia, looking at human rights across the region, but particularly in Hong Kong and China more broadly, what are your own sources of inspiration and your feelings about the state of human rights in this part of the world?
Well, I believe passionately in justice and in peace and security. And I think that those are the three pillars that you should rest any policy on, whether it's domestic or foreign policy. Often in foreign policy, it plays out in very sharply defined ways, particularly when you are dealing with countries where democracy is not the prevailing system, and people's rights can then be abused and the law can be broken with impunity, and authoritarian governments are not held to account. And for me, the purpose of politics and of democratic politics is to stand up for those who are perhaps not strong enough to stand alone, and to give a voice to the voiceless. And that's why I think it's vitally important that the United Kingdom has a foreign policy which is based on those principles, and which is always ready to speak out when we see human rights being abused, when we see international law being breached, and when we see the rights of those who are perhaps not strong enough to stand up for themselves being violated. And we need to send a very clear signal that democracy and our democratic values and our commitment to the rule of law, these are unshakable principles, and they need to be put into practice consistently, and they need to be put into practice in a way that is robust, and of course in a strong partnership and alliance with our other democratic allies. This is not something that Britain can do alone. You know, Britain alone is not a strategy, it's a recipe for disaster. We've got to build those alliances and work with our democratic allies to take those values forward and put them into practice.
Just building on what you've said there and applying it to the situation in Hong Kong and indeed China as a whole, throughout this year there's been a lot of cause for rethinking about the relationship with China and our response to particularly what's happened in Hong Kong in recent months. I wonder if you could just say a bit about what the Labour Party's strategy on this question of reassessing, reappraising the relationship with China and responding to what's happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so I think our starting point has been that the so-called golden relations between China and the United Kingdom, which was announced by David Cameron and George Osborne, has simply failed. It failed to deliver economically. We're still running approximately a £19 billion trade deficit with China. So the promised land of open access for British industry to China's market has not transpired. It has failed in terms of security. We're seeing an increasingly worrying tendency for saber rattling in the South China Sea. We're seeing China encroaching on Indian territory in the Himalayas. We're of course seeing increasing threats to Taiwan and the breaching of the Sino-British declaration in Hong Kong, which has a number of knock-on security implications. And it's not working in terms of human rights either. Again, the rule of law with Hong Kong, but also the persecution, the growing body of evidence around the persecution of the Uyghur in Xinjiang province. So if the idea behind the golden era was that there was going to be this increasing engagement, which was going to lead to a kind of gradual alignment between our values and interests and those of the Chinese Communist Party, that clearly has not happened. And the first point for Labour to make clear, as we are under our new leadership and under Keir Starmer's leadership and Lisa Nandy's leadership, that strategy of the so-called golden era has simply not worked. So the reset needs to be towards a strategy which is much more about being prepared to stand up and confront and challenge China when it is behaving in a way that's violating the values and interests that we hold dear. But also being ready, of course, to compete with China, but that competition has to take place on a level playing field in terms of the economy and trade. We need free and fair trade. We need intellectual property to no longer be stolen. We need protection for our companies. We need an active industrial strategy, which is actually about not becoming so reliant on supply chains that go through China or originate in China. But we also do have to cooperate. I mean, the UK takes over the chairmanship of COP26 next year. Climate change is absolutely at the heart of the UK-China relationship, and indeed the relationship between China and the rest of the world. And I think there's a genuine confluence of agendas and interests around tackling climate change, and we have to be able to cooperate and work in a constructive manner. So I think Labour's position is challenge and confront where necessary, compete, but has to be an open and level playing field, and cooperate when we're dealing with an existential crisis of climate. And I think those are the three guiding principles for our strategy going forward. And what I think we also believe and see very clearly is that this government is still in a sort of reactive mode when it comes to China, reacting to events, scrambling around somewhat when the latest policy position is announced by Beijing, and reacting to it rather than having a clear and coordinated strategy at the heart of government, which takes in everything from climate to security to human rights to trade and industrial policy, to cybersecurity, to dealing with pandemics. All of this needs to be integrated far more effectively at the heart of government.
Again, following on from what you said there, but looking more specifically at the breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy, the rule of law, the British government has done a few things. Of course, it announced its pretty unprecedented BNO package and suspended the extradition agreement, rightly so. What more do you think the British government should do in response to what's happened in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think we certainly welcome the BNO position, and we welcome the increasingly robust way in which the UK government, it's a welcome change from the golden era policy that I referred to earlier. So and Lisa Nandy has made that absolutely clear across the dispatch box in our Parliament to the Foreign Secretary, and we're looking to be a constructive opposition in this and supporting the government where they're getting it right. but calling out the issues when they're not. One of the things I think we've been surprised and disappointed by is that there were no Chinese Communist Party officials included in the so-called Magnitsky sanctions. We welcome the Magnitsky sanctions. We think they came 2 years too late. The primary legislation for them was passed in 2018. It's very difficult to understand why it took the government so long to actually put them into practice, but they've done that now, better late than never. But so far, no Chinese Communist Party officials have been sanctioned either for what's happening in Hong Kong or from what's happening in Xinjiang. So I think that would be an important first step. And I think the other key point is that we've got to look at the role of the police force in Hong Kong, and the British authorities are involved. British police and other authorities are involved in supporting the training of Hong Kong police, and also I think there are some British police officials that are in Hong Kong and being part of the rather concerning scenes and reports that we see of people's human rights not being respected. So I think we need to be supporting an inquiry into the role of the police, and particularly also in terms of what's been happening with first responders. Unfortunately, many of the pro-democracy demonstrations, the crackdown comes and there's sometimes violence occurs, and first responders come to the scene and are not being given access. And they do it on both sides. They're helping maybe police who've been injured and demonstrators, but they are not being given the possibility of actually carrying out their vitally important medical work. So there's 2 or 3 additional things I think that we need to see that really would send a strong message that we utterly condemn the national security law and the way in which it fundamentally undermines the one country, 2 systems principles of the Sino-British Declaration, and we urge Beijing to reconsider their position on this.
Well, in a way, you've anticipated some of my what would have been my further questions, because I was certainly going to ask about Magnitsky and indeed about the police. Just on the idea of a police inquiry, given that it's clearly originally the calls were for that to happen in Hong Kong as an independent inquiry. Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, made it clear that that just wasn't going to happen in Hong Kong. So do you think there's a mechanism for that to happen internationally, and how might that be set up?
Well, one of the things we really struggle with is this issue of international mechanisms. We're constantly challenged by the fact that the UN Security Council is stymied by the vetoes of certain permanent members. And we are lacking the tools, really, as an international community to act. And as I said, I just don't think this is something that Britain can do on its own. So one of the things I think we should certainly explore is the building of clearer and stronger alliances between democracies that have a really close and active interest in ensuring that what happens in, let's call it China's neighborhood, for want of a better term, it is happening in a way that's in the interests of the international community more broadly. So I think we do need to be talking more actively with the democracies in the region, the likes of Japan and Australia and New Zealand and other key democracies in the region, and with our European partners, to look at the whole range of issues around Hong Kong policing, also the plight of those who we know were trying to get away from Hong Kong on their way to Taiwan, the 12 who are now held in mainland China. But there needs to be a clear and unified international voice on this, and a kind of a league, if you like, a league of democracies, a coming together of democratic voices, an alliance with a focus on the Asia Pacific region. But with key players from outside the region, such as the United Kingdom, we have a very clear and strong voice and interest in securing the right outcomes in this part of the world. We need to come together. And so the answer to your question, I think, is it depends really on whether we can create an international mechanism that has the right basis and the right foundations to take some of these issues forward.
Absolutely. Two specific recommendations that have been made in recent months. One is the idea of forming a sort of international contact group. And that was an idea put forward by, I think, 6 or 7 former British foreign secretaries in a letter to the Prime Minister, foreign secretaries from both parties. But also there's been the recommendation that's come from an increasing number of figures around the world, including over 50 current serving UN special rapporteurs and a number of former UN special rapporteurs and the former head of the UN High Commission for Human Rights, for the establishment of either a UN special rapporteur on human rights in Hong Kong and indeed the rest of China as well, and or a UN special envoy that could be appointed by the Secretary General. Do you think there's mileage in both those ideas, a UN rapporteur or envoy and an international contact group?
I think we certainly need to look at those proposals very carefully. One of the challenges of being in opposition is always that you're not always party to all the briefing and information that government ministers get. And so from our position in opposition, we are making certain principles clear. And one is that we are profoundly concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong, and that international action needs to take place in order to get more transparency and more information and more understanding of what is happening there, and the same for Xinjiang and the Uyghur people. Now, there are a number of ways to address this issue, but certainly the role of special rapporteurs. We've seen how effective that was in the case of Myanmar, of course, where the compelling evidence that was gathered was then used in the case that the Gambia brought against the government of Myanmar at the International Court of Justice. None of that could have happened without the work of the special rapporteur laying the groundwork for that. So we see that as an effective mechanism, and we think it's something that the British government needs to look at and consider very carefully, and needs to respond rapidly to the suggestions, both around an international contact group and around the special rapporteur. So I think, in principle, we certainly support those. But of course, the devil is in the detail. We're not always party to the detail of how this would look in practice, but we certainly support the principle of more accountability and more focus on protecting international law and protecting human rights.
One of the pillars of Hong Kong that has made it so successful as an international financial centre and one of Asia's most important hubs has been the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. And it seems that those principles are coming under ever-increasing threat in Hong Kong. What's your view of that? And particularly, currently there are British judges who sit in Hong Kong's courts for periods of time, as well as Australian and Canadian and other foreign judges. Do you think the time has come to review that? Will they be able to continue to play that role constructively, or are they in effect giving credibility to a system that is losing credibility?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Benedict, that it's in nobody's interests for Hong Kong's reputation as a hub for financial activity and investment to be tarnished and to be undermined. It's not in China's interest. It's not in the interests of the international community. Huge amounts of investment flowing into China and out go through Hong Kong. And if people start to feel that the rule of law in Hong Kong can no longer be relied upon, then that is ultimately going to be very damaging to China as well as to the international community. So I hope that the Chinese Communist Party will see that we genuinely are all in this together, and that they should really be reconsidering their actions on that basis. In terms of the judges, I think it's one of these situations where we'd need to think very carefully about withdrawing judges from the Hong Kong courts, because in a sense you does really feel like you are then pulling up the drawbridge and walking away, and I would not wish to send a signal to the incredibly brave people who are campaigning for democracy and for the protection of the one country, two systems, that the international community has given up on them. So I think this is something that would need to be considered very carefully, and that you just need to be sure that you're not, in the end, biting off your nose to spite your face. That by taking this kind of action, you could potentially be sending a signal which is not helpful to those who we wish to support in Hong Kong.
Turning to the role of British businesses in Hong Kong, some of them have clearly come under pressure to actually support, not just stay silent, on the national security law. Some of the big banks and others. What's your view of that, and of what the British government could or should be doing to encourage British businesses not to compromise with the Chinese Communist regime?
We were profoundly disappointed by the statements made by certainly two of the very prominent banks that we picked up on. There may well have been more, and we did in fact write to the Foreign Secretary on that, and we've raised that concern with him in the chamber as well. And I was very pleased to see that the Foreign Secretary's response was that the rule of law and human rights should not be sacrificed on the altar of bankers' bonuses. And I thought that was a very powerful point from him. Now the question is, what's he going to do about it? What follow-up is taking place? And we have asked that and have not received an answer. Has he held meetings with the chief executives of those two banks? Is he stepping up the pressure on them to do the right thing, rather than to be cowed by the pressure that's clearly been put on them by the Chinese Communist Party? They need to think about the long-term implications of, okay, they may well take some of the heat off themselves now from the Chinese Communist Party by going along with what it's doing. But in the long term, as we've already identified, as if you start to undermine the rule of law in Hong Kong, that ultimately won't be good for the banking community, for any industry there, for any sector there. So they should take a stance on this which reflects the long-term interest, rather than just going for the kind of short-term appeasement of what the Chinese Communist Party wants them to do. And I've been very pleased to hear the strong rhetoric from our Foreign Secretary on that. I have yet to see any tangible action that he's taken.
Just turning in the final few minutes of our conversation to back to the UK, in terms of we've had this very generous announcement for BNOs. I know I've heard the Home Secretary say that she's also looking at and is very aware of the vulnerability of many young activists in Hong Kong who aren't BNOs but who may well need sanctuary somewhere. What do you think will be the impact on the UK of large numbers of Hong Kong people coming under either the BNO or other arrangements? And what can the UK do to prepare to welcome them and to make sure that they are well received and integrated and have a welcome here?
Yeah, we certainly welcome it, and I think the impact would be a very positive one. Not just because this is potentially a large number of very active, productive, smart, entrepreneurial people, and I think they would bring a lot to British society and to our economy and to our culture. But we do need to ensure that it's not only an offering for those who are BNOs and can easily tap into this. That we need to do more to ensure that there's support for those perhaps who are not as economically well off. So we need to ensure that our social security and benefit system is there for those who may need it coming over as BNOs. And in our universities, we should certainly look at being flexible around what kind of financial support can be offered to those who are coming to study in our universities who perhaps don't have the resources that others may have. So it needs to be a broad offer to BNOs that isn't just about, if you like, helping the economic elites. It's got to be a much broader piece. But I also think that we need to keep BNOs is a great offer, but what we want to see is, I think many of the people who might take up that offer would actually prefer to stay in Hong Kong. They're patriots who love their city and want it to succeed, but want it to succeed based on the rights and freedoms that they cherish. And so there's a big political and diplomatic piece of work that we must still keep doing. We mustn't give up and say, well, if it's evacuation rather than emancipation or empowerment. We want the people of Hong Kong to be able to live in freedom and to continue with the rights and privileges they have, and to be that incredibly dynamic and diverse group of people that they are in Hong Kong. And that the BNO offer should really be a last resort. So the one worry I have a little bit around the BNO is we shouldn't be saying this is our first resort. We should be saying it's our last resort. The top priority is to keep the political pressure on Beijing and on Carrie Lam and the Hong Kong executive to make it absolutely clear that nobody is benefiting from this, and that we want the people of Hong Kong to stay there, to benefit China, to benefit Hong Kong, to benefit the entire international community. And that's actually the right solution to this problem. But of course, offering the lifeboat of the BNO is also an important element in this debate.
Absolutely. One final question. It seems from everything you've been saying in this conversation and from other things I've heard you say, that there's a huge amount of cross-party consensus on this. People like Tom Tugendhat, dare I say it, Ian Duncan Smith, the Liberal Democrats, are all more or less saying similar things to you, and that's a really interesting cross-party position. Do you think that is a correct observation? Do you think that just as that exists in the United States, where the question of China, including Hong Kong, seems to be perhaps the only issue that Democrats and Republicans can more or less agree on, and if that is the case, what do you see the direction for UK-China relations over the next, say, decade, regardless of, in a sense, of what happens in our domestic politics, if there's at some point a change of government?
Yeah, I agree that there is certainly some confluence of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party's positions here, and we as a Labour Party, we want to be a constructive opposition. And we have a clear understanding of what our values are and what our national interest is. And those values and interests should transcend party politics in many ways. And this is about fundamental values of democracy, human rights, peace, justice, and security. And that's something that MPs share regardless of which political party they come from. The big question, I think, therefore, is not so much about the what or the why, it's about the how. And there I do feel that there's some divergence, because I just don't get a sense that there's a clear and integrated strategy on China emerging. It seems to be very reactive. And as I say, I think we need to see a cross-Whitehall, cross-departmental approach, bringing in, business, energy, industrial strategy, Department for Education as well, particularly around higher education and the issues around, the increasingly important role that Chinese students play in our higher education system. It's about 5G infrastructure. It's about security issues. So you need the MOD there. You need to have that joined up approach, and I don't see that coming from the government as things stand. So, I mean, going forward, I think that's where we need to be. We wish to push in the national interest, to push the government to have a clearer strategy that also is about building alliances. And whatever your views on Brexit, the reality is that I think over the last few years, the United Kingdom has come to be perceived as an alliance breaker rather than an alliance maker. And we've got a lot of work to do as a country, as a diplomatic corps, as a government, to start rebuilding some of those bridges. And I think there's a big job of work to do about getting a clearer set of strategic relationships in the Asia-Pacific region as well. And I'm not really seeing much of that from the government. I see a government that seems to have a kind of Britain alone strategy. Global Britain seems to be that we will just, strike out on our own. And in the modern world, that doesn't work. And we know that the Chinese Communist Party respects strength and consistency and is contemptuous of weakness and division. So we've got to have an alliance of democracies on this issue that are sending a very clear and consistent message. And this government has a tremendous amount of work to do in terms of rebuilding some of the bridges that it's burned through, unfortunately, the rather inept way in which Brexit in particular has been handled over the last 3 or 4 years. So I think there's a tremendous amount of cross-party consensus around what we want to achieve, which is about the national interest and about our values. But there is a tremendous amount of work to do from this government in terms of actually putting that into practice.
Absolutely. Just very finally, any final last words, given that many of our viewers will be Hong Kongers, some of them may be in Hong Kong, although of course the national security law makes it risky to view things like this, but some of them may be Hong Kongers from around the world. Any last words for them in particular?
Yes, I'm not going to mention names because I'm so worried about the very broad way in which the national security law is drafted and where people can get into trouble even for speaking with politicians, legislators from other countries, Hong Kong campaigners who I have spoken with. So I'm not going to mention any names, but they are people that I've been honored and privileged to meet with, both virtually via technology, but also in person. And, I want to send a very clear message that we stand shoulder to shoulder with you. We stand shoulder to shoulder with your wish to see a Hong Kong that is living on the basis of justice and peace and security and respect for your human rights, respect for your democratic rights. And we stand also in admiration of the courage that you show every day in terms of standing up for those rights in what is an incredibly difficult and sometimes dangerous situation that you find yourselves in. So my clear message to you all is that we in the Labour Party stand with you, and we share your aspirations, and we certainly will be standing and supporting you every step on the way on this very difficult journey that you're on. But I believe that in the end, the rights and the values that we hold dear will prevail.
Mm. Well, thank you so much. That message I know will be deeply appreciated, and we in Hong Kong Watch really appreciate the position you and Lisa Nandy and others on the front bench have taken on Hong Kong, the work you're doing, and your voice. So thank you so much, Stephen Kinnock, for making time to talk with us today and for all you're doing.
That's a pleasure. Many thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.